Valley Reporter, and I'd like to first introduce Jack Garvin from the Warren Store, whose idea. The mic's not on?
Yes.
Let me drag it a little closer. Let me introduce Jack Garvin from the Warren Store, whose idea it was to host this forum. Jack, you want to stand up? The Warren Store, as you know, has been the subject of several break-ins, as have other properties in Warren Village throughout this year and last year as well, Jack?
Over the course of a number of years, but last November there were 2 episodes.
Thank you. What we have is a group of law enforcement panelists and town officials, several of whom are missing and will be in a bit. Starting on my right is Vermont State Police Lieutenant Paul White, who is the Middlesex Barrack Station Commander. With him is Sergeant Mark Thomas from the Vermont State Police. And we have Ken Kaplan, who is the Chief of the Stowe Police Department. And next to him is Washington County Sheriff Sam Hill and his Deputy Brett Mayer. And what I'd like to do is ask each of these officials a couple of questions about how their department works. And then we'll throw it open to questions from our town officials and then open to questions from you. Representing our towns are Charlie Hosford, a member of the Waitsfield Select Board, and Jared Cadwell, a member of the Facein Select Board. We're expecting Adam Gresham from Warren, who is our state representative. He's also a principal in Sugarbush, and we're interested to hear how Sugarbush is addressing issues related to security. And we're expecting someone from the Warren Select Board, but we're a little unclear who that might be. We also have in the House Bill Piedman and Ray Munn, local constables, as well as Clayton Paul Cormier Jr., who represents the Warren Neighborhood Watch Program. You guys want to raise your hands, constables? Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to start with you, Paul. Can you explain how much state police coverage or service is available to the Valley towns? Can we get more? There used to be a program where communities could basically buy a trooper for a certain sum of money. That was about 20 years ago. Does that program still exist? And what can communities do to protect themselves from rising property crimes?
Need to take notes.
I'll go back.
Well, I'm not sure. Everybody hear me? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by how much law enforcement is available. Just to give you, put it in context a little bit, out of the Middlesex Barracks, when we're fully staffed, I have a team of 14 troopers and 3 supervisors. And with those 14 troopers, we provide basic law enforcement services to 18 towns in Washington and part of Orange County, in addition to patrolling a 35-mile stretch of Interstate 89. So doing the math, and again, like I said, that's 14 troopers is when we're fully staffed.
And are you fully staffed?
Currently, we have 2 vacancies, and we have a 3rd trooper who is deployed with the National Guard headed for Afghanistan. So that brings us down to 11 troopers, 3 sergeants, to cover those 18 towns. As you can imagine, that it doesn't give us the ability to pay as much attention to any one individual community as we would like to. And I'm sure most of you probably know, if not, you'll know now. I mean, we've never had 24-hour coverage. Vermont State Police has never had a 3rd shift. I'm not aware of any plans in the immediate future to put on a 3rd shift. We have a day shift that runs roughly from 7 a.m. to 5, and an evening shift that runs from 4 to 2 in the morning, but between 2 and 7, we're on call. The program that you're talking about, I believe, you're talking about what used to be called our COPS program. A town could, for an annual contracted amount of money, could have a trooper dedicated to that town. It came with the trooper, the training, the car. We haven't entered into any of those contracts at least 10 years or so, I would say. So that is no longer available. What you had down here in the valley was our old outpost system. Up until mid-90s, we had the 3 valley towns, Waitsfield, Warren, and Facein, were part of an outpost where we had 3 troopers dedicated to these 3 towns. Not to say they never got called away, because they would sometimes get called out of the valley to back up other troopers, but generally speaking, you had 3 troopers that lived here in the valley, were assigned here, and that was their primary assignment. That program went away somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 years ago, or maybe 12 years ago. Not just here, but statewide. We had outposts all over the state. Locally, we had an outpost here, and we had an outpost in the Plainfield area. They both were abolished for a couple of reasons. One is the troopers in those outposts made extra money, so it was a little bit of a financial thing, but primarily it was, how do you justify, when you only have 14 troopers to go around to cover 18 towns, how do you justify giving these 3 towns down here, basically one town, 1 trooper per town, when the other 15 towns are sharing the remaining 11 troopers?
Well, how was that justified? Was that a
Well,
political deal?
Well, the outpost system existed for many, many years. I'd have to do some research to tell you how it began, but it just got to be harder and harder to justify. So, what was the next
The
part of
final
the
part of the
question?
question was, what can communities do to protect themselves from rising property crimes? Do you have any advice for us, given the constraints you work under?
Well, there's a variety of things. We have, you have the Neighborhood Watch Program, which I see prominently displayed here. I know Clayton Paul and also Fred Messer have been instrumental in getting that rolled out down here in the valley. There is additional training available for that if there are more people that want to be trained up on how to run an active Neighborhood Watch program. You have your alarm systems, which different people have different opinions on how effective they are. I'm not sure exactly what type of advice you're looking for. You have some constables here who have varying levels of activity. I know you introduced Bill Peatman, but my understanding is he has retired from the constable business. You have Peter here in Waitsfield and Ray covering Moortown and Facein, or just Facein now. But there's a limit to what they can do. They're not paid positions. They're generally volunteers. Limited amount of training. There's a limit to how much you can expect from someone in a volunteer position.
Thanks. Thank you, Paul. Ken, can you explain how the Stowe Police Department is organized, the type of coverage you provide, your personnel, and the cost of your police department? And what type of crimes are you experiencing in Stowe?
Well, Stowe's lucky, we don't have any crime. Area-wise, Stowe is supposedly the largest square mileage in the state. There's 72 square miles that we cover. I have, including my civilian personnel, I have 15 full-timers and 10 part-timers. There's a chief, a detective, a patrol sergeant, a patrol corporal, and the rest are patrolmen. We also have the luxury of having a full-time animal control officer, one of, I think, only 5 in the state. We have 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 365 days a year coverage. A few years ago, the commissioner, Sleeper, was asked these comparison questions as how Stowe and the state police and why does Stowe have the luxury. And I don't want to call it a luxury, but that's what it is. The taxpayers of Stowe want that service. They want 24-hour service. When they call, I tell my officers, it's the most important thing on your mind when you call. Otherwise, you wouldn't be calling. So that's how we treat it. And so when you call, we respond. I usually have 2 people on, 2 officers on, road officers on a shift. And we handle everything from, every type of crime there is, from the burglaries down to a cat up a tree. Might have missed one of those.
What's the cost of your department?
This year, we're coming in at about almost 1.6.
Do you have any guess what that comes down to per, I don't have a calculator, but someone might, what that comes down to per taxpayer?
No, I don't.
What's the population of Stowe, 5,000?
Well, it's about 5,000, but day to day, they've annualized it out to 9,900. So we're dealing with almost 10,000 people on a day-to-day basis.
Throughout the year, throughout the
Throughout the
course of the year. And you said you do provide 24-hour coverage?
Yes, we do, 24 every single day.
And did you also, you mentioned to me on the phone that your officers are all certified EMTs?
Right. We were at one time, I think there's one other agency in the state now, we were the only first responder agency in the state, and all my people at one time were EMTs. So normally when a rescue call comes in, we're first on scene, and so we are trained, to handle all those type of things. Now a couple of them have let their lapse. There's a lot of training involved. It's 120 hours to become an EMT. And we have a very good rescue squad, Stowe also. And of course, they're quite busy by going up to the mountain a half a dozen times a day. But we're there, and usually, except for the mountain calls, we're first on scene pretty much at everything. And I think that that's important when you're calling, and the state police, do a tremendous job, but at 2 o'clock in the morning, if you're having something, I always relate this at town meeting, if you have someone breaking into your home, how long do you want to wait? If your child is choking, or if your wife is having a seizure, how long do you want to wait? Because we can be there in a matter of, a few minutes, as opposed to even the rescue squad is going to take 20 minutes to get there. And time matters, and that's what the residents of Stowe want.
What happens during budgeting season, especially in years like this, when even level funding school budgets causes taxes to go up? Is there a hue and cry for budget reduction?
There always is in this economy, in this day and age. I was just telling, I forget who it was, just a couple minutes ago. Last year, the police department is the highest budget in town. And as being the highest budget, there's always going to be someone who wants to cut. Now, someone can get up on the floor of town meeting and they can say, we want to cut your budget $10,000. We can probably find $10,000. But if you get up and you say that we want to cut 100 or 200,000, what you're talking is manpower. And if you start cutting manpower, then you start cutting services. And then I'll ask you on the floor of town meeting, because this is what happens, what do you want? Because the first thing I'm going to cut is that late night shift. So there won't be anyone out there from 2 to 7 in the morning. Last year, the animal control officer had over 700 calls. We do, as Carrie Sleeper said, we're a luxury. We afford luxuries to the residents and the visitors of Stowe that a lot of other communities can't. Having said that, the animal control officer would be the next one to go, and that's by seniority. She is, junior on the pole. So it depends on what you want. And actually, when you mention that, last year, and I think I just said this to the sergeant, one of my most prolific antagonists got up when it came to this. They said, we're going to now discuss the police department budget. And there was a giant groan in the audience. And he got up and said, before this chief gets up and starts talking, I know we'd all like to cut. He says, but he's going to tell you all the different things that I've just alluded to. And he says, I'd like to cut too, but I want the service, and I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to vote to cut it. And so when having one of my antagonists get up there and say that, well, my budget was passed in, like 3 minutes, and on we went to the next thing.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can an officer
Charlie, you
make
might
a,
want to grab the microphone.
can an officer in your department make a living? And what would be a starting salary for a patrolman, a patrol person?
I believe it depends on your qualifications. If you came in completely green, I believe the starting pay is somewhere between $32,000 to $35,000 a year. Depending on your level of experience, if let's say Sergeant Thomas came in and wanted to work for my agency, I take all his years of experience, give him credit, I think the town gives credit for half of them, and we place him, in a spot. Stowe also has the luxury of special events. We probably have more special events than probably everybody else in the state put together. Now, we have dog shows, horse shows, car shows. The mountain hires us every single day to be up there. We charge for those special events. Last year, we netted, I think, over $80,000 in revenue coming back to the town to offset, some of the budget. But so that when you ask, can they make a living? They work a lot of. There's overtime, and then there's special events that all the officers can work.
I'm curious what the starting salary for a trooper is.
34,000.
Around 34?
And can I just ask a
Sure.
question? Chief, you said your annual operating budget is 1.6 million, but would you have any idea if you had to go from 0 to what you have now, any idea at all what the startup cost would be?
Well, it depends on what you want. You mean if Waitsfield we're starting a PD, how many men do you want? How many cars do you want? You have to have a housing for them. I mean, everything costs. I don't know how everyone else, but in Stowe, the benefit package is very good. They have a 37% benefit package. So I've got there was a survey that came out, I think 2 years ago, that was done by the Vermont Leagues of Cities and Towns that showed Stowe was the highest cost per officer in the state. And how do I justify that? I justify it by saying, well, my top 6, 7 guys have been there for 25 to 30 years. If I gave them a 1% pay raise every year, they're making, with benefits, $125,000, $130,000 a year. So that's why my cost is so high. What you have to figure out is, if you're hiring a new person to come in, I'm gonna pay him $35,000, his benefits are gonna be probably another $15,000, that's $50,000 for the person. It's probably gonna cost a couple, $3,000 to get him uniformed. A car, is gonna, if you don't have a car, obviously, a car is gonna cost you, $25,000, $30,000. You've gotta get the car equipped. There's another, $3,000. You've gotta to get the cars marked. There's a couple $1,000s. It's not cheap, to start out, and depending on what you want, how many people you want, how many cars you want, how much proactivity you want. I don't know if that answers it.
Those are good questions. I want to get to Sam at the Washington County Sheriff's Department, and then I encourage this kind of cross-questioning, because I think it's helpful to everybody here to hear. Sam, you're the most visible face of law enforcement in the Valley, you and your deputies, and you've got a fairly long history going back to, your department goes back to 1986-ish, right? When the Valley town started contracting with you.
It's been over 20 years.
I'm wondering if you could explain a couple of things, how the cross-patrol program works in Warren and Waitsfield and Moortown, and what the costs are that are associated with that. And I'm also curious if there's limits to how much coverage and what types of coverage you can provide. Are your officers limited to traffic patrol, or can they catch bad guys? And wait, I have one more question. Right. And can you also explain, and I'm guessing you're the person to explain this, the new state regulations, and maybe somebody else is, if it's not you, the new state regulations requiring constables, town constables to be trained? Which one of you guys can address that?
All of the above.
Okay, all of the above. All right, we'll come back to that.
I think we all can tell a little bit about it.
So I'll let you start, because I gave you a whole pile of questions.
Okay. To start with, just to let people know a little bit about how a sheriff's department works. To start with, our main function by statute is to transport prisoners and serve civil process. So that's our main goal above all else. We're funded in many different ways. We have a small county budget, which is just a little over $200,000, which pays for basic amenities and most of it's laid out by statute. I have my office staff that's paid for by the county budget. Training, equipment, basic necessities to run the office is coming out of that county budget. Everybody else and everything that's paid for beyond that is paid for on money raised by the department. So a sheriff's department in Vermont is a small business, and we're forced to be that to be able to operate. For instance, back to our state mandates of transporting prisoners and serving civil process. By statute, we're told we have to do that, but we're not given any cars or equipment to be able to do that with. We have the luxury here in Washington County to have 2 state-paid deputies, which their main function is transporting the prisoners, and their salary is paid for by the state. So above and beyond anything else, their main function is to transport prisoners. Anybody else that works for the department is paid for the department on funds raised by the department. And the cruisers and equipment for those people, and actually for our state-paid deputies, because we are the only state law enforcement officers, myself and my 2 state-paid deputies, and the same throughout the state, that aren't provided uniforms, cruisers, and equipment by the state. Occasionally, we do get some funding from the state to pay for different items, but usually it's because there's money left over in the transport budget that we're able to utilize to do that. Otherwise, we're standing in the road directing traffic so that we can buy the cruisers and equipment to do the other functions that we do. So that's why you see us directing traffic, following Pike on the interstate and whatnot. Secondary to that, we do patrols, and we contract with different communities to do that because in 1977, a case Stowe versus Lamoille went to the Supreme Court, where the town of Stowe said to the Lamoille County Sheriff's Department or the county of Lamoille, why are we paying for police services when we have a police department? And the Supreme Court here in Vermont said, you're absolutely right, towns don't need to pay county taxes for law enforcement. So the funding that goes to the county isn't for patrol functions. So we contract for patrol. So if someone wants us to come and do something, and that was really hard for me when I went from a municipality working for the city of Barrie for 20 years to the sheriff's department, and someone would call and say, we need your help, and I would say, how are you going to pay for that? Because if I'm going to send my deputies, if for instance, you have an abuse prevention order against you, and you need someone to go to law enforcement to go to a residence with you, I have to pay my deputy to do that. I don't have a budget to pay that person, so I have to ask the individual to pay to be able to send the deputy. And that's hard to do, but it's the reality of a sheriff's department, because how else am I going to pay the staff? The money has to come from somewhere. So for us, we patrol anywhere, depending on the year, having contracts from 8 to 10 towns. Right now, we have 8 towns that we contract with. To keep our costs low, we charge a low rate to be able to augment what the state police is able to do with covering criminal complaints, where we're able to show a presence and provide safety on the highways. And that's our main goals with the contracts we have. Our contracts run anywhere from $1,500 up to out here where Warren pays $34,000. I'll get to our cross patrol and the cost in a minute. The reason that we limit our patrols to highway safety type things with motor vehicle patrol is because, again, cost. If we began taking criminal complaints, then that generates more paperwork, more data entry, and I would need another person. We contract for our dispatch, other than Monday through Friday, when I have my secretary who dispatches, and if we took on more where dispatch would be more, I would have to contract for more dispatch with the city of Barrie. So it's cost prohibitive for us at this point to do more, and we can do more, it's just the communities have to pay more. Unfortunately, one community saying, we'd like you to come out for 40 hours a week would be very cost prohibitive, because we still have to pay that higher dispatch fee. I'm still going to need that added office personnel. So that's the reality of trying to do piecemeal law enforcement. The other part that you should think about is taking complaints on a part-time basis is really disjointed. If we're out here between Waitsfield and Warren, we're out here for 40 hours a week. And we work some days, we work some evenings. And if you call in a burglary at your house and we happen to be working, we may take it. We may go off duty and not come back for 2 or 3 days. Your neighbor comes home, finds a burglary, the state police are called and they go. Chances are it's the same people that committed those 2 burglaries, but now you've got 2 different departments working the same case and may not necessarily know it. So it's hard to take complaints on a part-time basis and not have it disjointed, and it's not really fair to a community. It can work. It's a lot of work to make it work. And the other issue that we run into, again, is back to, if we're taking complaints, is dispatch, is who is going to dispatch. The state police, with their functions and their availability, don't really have the ability to take on more people for dispatch, so that puts us back to contracting with Barrie City. And Len, how do those calls come in? So these are some of the hurdles that you have to come over. How does the call get forwarded, depending on the time of the day and who's answering?
So can I just throw in a quick question here? As I understand it, it sounds like the impediment to responding to criminal complaints on a full-time basis is money.
It's funding,
It's
yes.
strictly funding. It's not a question of training.
Well, no. I mean, it all revolves around training, because the more functions you're going to provide, the more training in those areas you need. So if we begin to take a higher level of complaints, then yes, we would have to train our people differently to be able to adequately handle those complaints. But that's an issue anywhere. I mean, that's
But is
just the
there no
reality.
demand for that service from the communities you serve?
We've been here before to Warren a couple of times.
Yeah.
We've been to Waitsfield on a smaller scale for the same question. And whenever I say we can do it, but it's going to cost a lot more, we've always been told we're really happy with what you're doing. Today, to prepare, I wasn't really sure which direction we were going, but I thought we were going to be looking at what's it going to cost to cover this area. So I did a couple of things. Currently, to answer your question about cross patrol, because I can answer that really quickly and then I can move forward, is Waitsfield pays for approximately 16 hours a week of patrol. Warren pays for 24 hours a week patrol. So what we do in the cross patrol is for 32 hours a week, we rotate between Waitsfield and Warren. It's a fluid patrol that covers both communities at the same time. The added 8 hours that Warren pays for, they get an additional 8 hours at separate times for the separate patrol that they're paying. So it's, it works well that we're able to float between the two communities and have a presence in both communities, because otherwise what can happen is they see us in Waitsfield and they figure, well, when I get to Warren, I can speed because nobody's there. So we're able to rotate back and forth and show a presence in both towns. So that's kind of how the cross patrol works. So in preparation for this meeting, thinking that folks are looking for what's it going to cost to have a police department out here of some type. So I looked at the bare minimums, and most 24/7 coverage looks at 5 to 7 people. 6 is a good average to be able to cover all the shifts and cover all the vacancies. To get started, the Lamoille County Sheriff's Department contracts with 3 towns: Johnson, Woken, and Hyde Park. And the way the cost is broken down, is too complicated for me to explain. They'd have to do that for you. It's based on the number of calls per service in each community. So not all the communities pay equally. But the overall budget for that 3 towns for 7 deputies is $768,000. But that does not include communications. And I wasn't able to break down their communications cost, because their communications that they bill each community for not only include police, but fire and rescue. So I went to a small department that has, actually, Lamoille, I'm sorry, they have 6 deputies that are working. Went to Barrytown Police Department, who has approximately 7 officers that are working, and has a similar complaint load. And their yearly budget is $740,000 approximately. That again does not include dispatch costs. So I went to the city of Barry, who dispatches for the Barrytown Police Department, and they said they were able to break out the costs that they pay, and that's about $160,000. So for law enforcement of a 6-man department, 24/7 in Barrytown, it would run about $900,000. So that would be about the same cost, somewhere in that same ballpark, for a sheriff's department to be able to do a 24/7 patrol. Now, we had talked earlier, was your cost, did that include your overall dispatch cost too, or was that above?
No, I have another $270,000 for dispatch.
Dispatching is a very expensive proposition. And, it's actually cheaper to, in some cases, in our case, it would be cheaper to contract for that dispatch service and lump it in with other communities that are paying for the dispatch than to hire 5 or 6 dispatchers to work 24/7 and have that coverage. It's actually much more cost effective to do that.
Thank you.
Did I answer?
That was a lot of information, Sam, I appreciate it.
And I'm not sure if I got to everything before I was trying to answer about the constables.
Well, I think we have a couple of constables here. active constables, and I know that the state regulations have changed, and constables are now required to have a level of certification that they have not required in the past. Perhaps one of you would explain that and then we've got some constables here. Maybe Ray, you would like to explain briefly the working group that you and Peter Laskowski and I'm not sure who else, Bill have put together. But let me just go, let's hear about what constables have to do now.
I don't know all the dynamics of the constables. I'll be the first one to say that, and I know that there was a statute put in place a couple of years ago that goes into effect, is it this July? That requires constables to be certified law enforcement officers to have law enforcement capabilities in their communities, but I'm not sure of the exact dynamics of why that came to be. And I don't know if you gentlemen have a
Ray, you want
better
to give us
handle on that.
the 2-minute version of it?
186 hours for any
Constables required 186 hours of training.
for any part-time officers, which includes constables.
Okay, did y'all hear that? 186 hours of training for any part-time
And that's actually minimal, and I can explain.
That's minimum.
That's the minimum. I can explain the training, I just don't know the politics behind why that statute went into play. And I have my theories, like everybody might have their theories, and I hate to throw them out because I could be very wrong.
We have a representative of the legislature in the House. We can ask Adam about that when we get over to that side of the table. We'll let Adam answer that.
But I can explain the training and some of the impediments to the training, because that's really a holdup. And I think there's legislation, when I was at the State House yesterday, that they said they were kicking around about either pushing the deadline back or doing away with it altogether, but I won't steal your thunder. So the training aspect, for any part-time certified officer in the state of Vermont, they have to go through a 3-phase training program. The first phase is 58 hours of training at the Vermont Police Academy. Once you pass that program, then you go into the Phase 2 and Phase 3 program, which can be happening at the same time, and most often they do. Phase 2 is a minimum of an additional 50 hours of classroom-style, academy-style training. That's really a myth when you start looking at getting officers to work, because to go to DUI school, that's a week, that's 40 hours. You're also mandated to go to a domestic violence class, which is 8 hours. Radar certification is 8 hours. You have to have bloodborne pathogens, you have to have first aid, hazardous materials, control and restraint. So that 50 hours is the minimum, but you can't get the training in that you need to be certified and actually be able to work and do anything in that 50 hours. And then Phase 3 is working with a field training officer for a minimum of 60 hours. And with everybody that we've put through the part-time program, because the majority of the staff at the Sheriff's Department are part-time, they come out of the academy, they're gung-ho, they're ready to go, and they're like, oh, 60 hours. And then about between 50 and 70 hours, I'll ask them, so how do you feel? Are you ready to go on your own? Not one of them have said yes, because there's so many things that you have to know before you can go out and patrol on your own. And being that we do so many different functions and we fill in and we be backup, I don't want someone that's minimally trained working for me, because if they're going to back up the state police or a local municipality or one of my own people, I want them to know what they're doing. So that's the training. Now, as I understand, and part of my problem with stepping in to help with the constables in getting their training is some of it is financial, some of it is liability. For my people to go through an FTO program, they put in with a field training officer between 100 and 150 hours of training. I would have to pay my field training officers to be able to do that. And both of my field training officers are actually state paid deputies. So they try and work it in between their transports. So it's tough to shuffle them to be able to do that. The other is liability, is to sign off on the documentation saying that this person is fully certified and fully trained, and then send them out to work when you have no supervision over them. You're not able to retrain that person, you're not able to control their actions. So that's a liability issue that departments throughout the state are looking at. Now, constables amongst themselves have issues with training because, and I didn't know this until one of the academy staff told me this last year, they opened it up so that part-time certified officers could become field training officers. In hopes, or what the hopes was in doing that, was that constables that are already certified part-time could go to the academy and become field training officers and then help each other out. Well, what they found beyond that was communities weren't really excited about that because you're limited to your law enforcement within your community. So to have another constable come and train, you either have to assign them as a second or third constable in your community so that they have authority to be there, or if you go to train, you have to become a constable in that community so that you can train in that community. And then it's a matter again of who's picking up the liability. So there was a lot of issues surrounding the FTO program, and that's caused a lot of hate and discontent, and I fully understand that, with the constables, because there's a program in place, but it's almost unattainable to some extent because of cost and liability issues and whatnot.
So do you understand the Rochester program? Can you give me a little more 2 or 3 sentence description of that?
I can't say that I entirely understand what they do, but I know that Rochester, like many towns, has both a first and a second constable. But their first constable, his name is Tom Simpson, and my understanding is he's also a full-time certified police officer. He works for Randolph Police Department. So he's had the training, full-time training, and he, as a second job, I guess you would call it, is the constable for the town of Rochester. The town owns their own car.
And then he also covers Hancock, is that correct?
I
Hancock
believe
and
he's also
Rochester?
designated as a second constable in Hancock, and the Hancock constable is designated, cross-designated in Rochester.
And so they're providing 24/7?
No, I don't know what they work for shifts, and I don't know the extent of what they handle for calls. I know they handle some calls. They are dispatched out of our office in Royalton. State Police out of Royalton is the primary law enforcement agency down there, but the constables do handle a fair amount of calls.
Can anyone contract for your dispatching services? Any law enforcement agency?
Legally, yes. We have the ability to enter into contracts, however, we're not looking to take on any more dispatching clients, for lack of a better term, right now, simply because our dispatch center is already taxed out.
And I was actually going to raise my hand, was to talk about the dispatch issue with constables, because I've talked with many constables throughout the county, including a constable that works for me, not Peter, another constable, about them being able to use our channel and use dispatch through the sheriff's department. To start with, to be able to get any motor vehicle or criminal information, they have to go through a course through BCIC and be certified and have signed off that they have a dispatch that they can work with to be able to afford that information. For instance, if a constable wants to be able to run a license plate or a license check, they have to be certified through the state and have an assigned dispatch to be able to do that. My problem, again, is back to cost. There's 20 towns in Washington County. 6 have police departments, so that leaves 14 with constables, and some have more than one constable. And if the constables all start using my dispatch, again, I'm paying for that dispatch, and it's based on a per use. So my cost goes up if I allow people to use it. So now that I've been Mr. Negative since we've been here, because that's what I feel like I've been doing, because it's all about cost, the reason that I did the little bit of research with the Sheriff's Department in Barrytown and with Barry City was to let you know that anything is possible. It just depends on whether it can be funded, and we all understand that. We would like to be able to give the service away for free. We would like to be able to do a lot more than we do, but we all have our costs, whether it's the town, whether it's the Sheriff's Department, whether it's the state police. And that's why I just wanted to give you some idea what you'd be looking at if you went on your own. or if you went with the sheriff's department. And it's from the real extreme to the Cadillac to, getting the Escort and getting started and plugging along until you can afford more. So there's a lot of different options, but they are costly.
Thank you, Sam.
Could I ask a
Sure.
question as to what is dispatching? What specific duties does dispatching involve? Because it seems to be a big deal.
It is. It's a big deal. For an officer, they're our lifeline. So a dispatch answers the call, the incoming call to start with. And then they keep in communication with us on the radio. Beyond that, what they do is they have to be certified as a dispatcher, which means they know how to use all the computer system. They can run registrations, they can run license checks, they can run for criminal records check, they can run to see if people are wanted, they can enter information for stolen or missing persons, they can check to see if someone has an abuse prevention order. And they keep track of all this, they keep it entered in the computer, they print what we need printed, they keep us going in the right direction, and that's what they do 24/7.
Mark, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to point out, when the sheriff was talking, I know that you do a lot of your patrols with part-time certified people. And when you listen to him talk about the number of hours it takes to get a part-timer up and running, to give you an example of full-time certification with the state police, because that's what I know. Our state troopers come on, they do a 3-week pre-basic before they go to the regular police academy. There's 120 hours of training they receive in that pre-basic. And then the 600 plus hours they receive.
16 weeks.
16 weeks of full-time academy, and then another 3 weeks of our post-basic, which is another 120 hours.
But if you're not certified at DUI, there's another 2 weeks after that. So
Right.
the academy's really 18 weeks.
So you take that, and then our troopers come out of those, however many weeks that is, 16. So they go from that into our FTO process, and our FTO process is a minimum of 36 working days, actually 38 working days. So you end up with another 300 plus hours on top of that. So you can have part-time certified people that can do basic law enforcement functions, but you're not comparing apples to apples when you talk full-time and certified people. And that's not to step on anybody's toes or to point fingers, but that's the reality.
Well, I think we all recognize that, there's tiers of certification and tiers of law enforcement. I do want to hear briefly from one of the constables about the work that you guys have been doing. If you could just give me an overview of that, and then I'd like to let our elected officials ask some questions, and then open it up to the floor for questions. Which one of you constables is going to talk?
Well, I can probably start off. I resigned about a week and a half or so ago.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Bill Peatman from Warren. I was the second constable for about a year and a half till about a week and a half. I had to resign due to a health problem. First of all, I want to thank Lieutenant Paul White for allowing me to come to his radio, which I did, and I don't think we had any problem with it. But the problem that exists between Washington County sheriffs and the state police, the communication was not there for us. We had to go, I spent a lot of time over in the office because I knew one of the troopers, and in the 30, 40 years I've been around, I've had pretty much a finger involved in the state police business as an outside informant, and some for Washington County Sheriff deputy when they were here, who has moved away. Our biggest complaint was no communication through the state police unless we really got out and fought to get it. Say nothing about coming from Washington County Sheriff's Department other than Peter and I have known each other since high school years. The feeling was, and I probably going to get a lot of flack for this from the Middlesex Barracks, was Danaher's constables, which meant that we were not probably capable of performing any duties. Well, After we found that we weren't called, we weren't informed of anything, we sort of figured that we would try to put together a little system to see what we could do to get money, which there was grant programs and things that we could go through. And we felt after attending the constables meeting down at the police academy that we were just pounding our heads against the wall because we weren't going to get anywhere. They put the programs in place, but they didn't put, like the sheriff said, like FTOs. It was limited areas that weren't accessible to us. Even if we went and got our own FTO person, he would have to be appointed by the town of Warren if he wanted us to be trained, and then be appointed by Waitsfield after he got his FTO to train us. And then once we got through that training, then the towns would have to go out and pay the excess money to find your own training down the road. And then it came to the point where I think the sheriff made the remark that you couldn't be on the radio, which to call in specific registrations or ROs or things like that. So we were limited to what we could call, but we had the ability, or I did out here, thanks to the lieutenant, that if I was out on patrol, I could call his office and get help. Or if there was something really endangered, I could call. Well, I asked the Washington County Sheriff one time if his deputy was out there and I was in an emergency situation, if I could call him. And his words were to me, you have channel 1 where the state police call, and you also have channel 2 to the cars. You could reach them on one of those channels. Other than that, I don't care who the federal government is or whatever. If there's an individual out there and in trouble, a $5 fee to cross call, it's not going to hurt. When our town is already paying him to be out here.
Thank you,
It's
Bill.
not the working relationship between the constables and the state police and the sheriff's department. And this was very well shown in the couple years that we have been there. And this is basically why I never showed up at the state police barracks anymore.
Thank you for that explanation. I would like to introduce our elected officials here. We have Andy Cunningham from the Town of Warren Select Board, Adam Gresham, who is the state representative for Waitsfield, Warren, and Facein, and also is a principal in Sugarbush, and we're interested in how Sugarbush addresses security. We've got Jared Cadwell and Charlie Hosford, both Select Board members from Facein and Waitsfield, respectively. Do either of you have a specific question for one of our panelists, or Adam, do you want to answer the question? Do you want to answer the hot potato question about why do we have to certify constables? And then you might as well tell us about what Sugarbush
I think I'm going to dump that question. But I will say, in that regard, you mentioned, I think, 150 hours of training. Is that the number that you used?
186.
Our deputies work with a field training officer for between 100 and 150 hours, depending on the deputy.
And I think, at one point, there was some confusion about who pays for that. And, the state should pay for that. The state has asked for it. The state will pay for that. That's, I would say, one of the few things the state will gladly pay for. But the training of constables and the like from the towns to the state will pick up that tab. But I think I'm going to step aside from the politics of it. Candidly, I would like to talk about it. I'm just not familiar with why that was put in place. But I would like to make just a couple of comments.
Could you please speak into the microphone? It's hard to hear.
Thank you. I would like to make just a couple of comments. And I apologize for coming late, but in the time that I was here, I heard the word cost or expense used quite frequently, and I'm sympathetic with that. It's probably always been an issue, but now it's a particularly significant issue. And I couldn't help bring with me a recent agreement it's called a memorandum of agreement between four agencies, all having to do with public safety or state-level law enforcement. And the agreement's between the Department of Public Safety, the Department of Motor Vehicles, the Department of Liquor Control, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I think you gentlemen may be familiar with this, but there is an initiative that has been launched to integrate these agencies so that they work together under the general umbrella of the Department of Public Safety. And that initiative was spoken about, debated, and launched by the Public Strategies Group, which has looked at many different aspects of the state government. But one of their thoughts was that many of the people who work for these agencies have similar training, similar background. They're performing different tasks, but it would be advisable and more cost-effective and probably more efficient if they worked under the same umbrella. But the reason I bring that is really to illustrate kind of the depth of the change that is envisioned. And many people would say the depth of change that is required. So we have many challenges that we face. And, you know, to me, this really illustrates just a major initiative. I'm not here to editorialize on whether it's a good idea or not. This, I'm sure, will receive a full-throated debate from the various agencies that are involved. This was launched several weeks ago, and it will be debated in the next couple of weeks. The one kind of final comment I'd make is the key word that's being spoken about at the state level is called regionalization. And this is, I think, representative of the fact that regions, and the state is encouraging this, that regions need to see to their own law enforcement needs. I think this is both efficient and probably inevitable with the cost scenario or with the budget scenario that we face. But, you know, Lisa, you mentioned Sugarbush. You know, maybe the ultimate example of that is something that we have done over the past 3 or 4 years, and that is that we had issues with theft, mostly petty, but we also had some major thefts. And so we went off and we hired, many of you may know Hunter North. This was a security firm. They were a private firm. They were not law enforcement people, but although many of them had law enforcement backgrounds. And they patrolled in and around the resort. They covered from Mount Ellen to Lincoln Peak. And 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I went and spoke with the various condominium associations that we have that are in and around the resort. And we spoke to the homeowners associations, and we asked them if they would care to join us and contribute to the cost of additional patrol. When we first started, we had weekend patrols. And that was really intended to have people in and around the base area while the mountain was operating to make sure people's skis were not taken, that people's possessions were not taken. And that was actually quite successful. It's maybe not at all surprising, but just the presence of someone there, I think, had a dramatic impact. And we, incidentally, are not alone. Many resorts, in fact, I would argue most resorts, have something along these lines. But we thought it would be both better for us and better for the surrounding communities if we expanded that patrol to include 5 days. Actually, in the ideal world, we'd have a 7-day-a-week patrol. And it wouldn't be 24 hours, it would be about 15 to 18 hours. So they would typically come on when the resort opened in the morning, and they would stay through the evening hours, but it would not be an overnight patrol. And the reason for that simply had to do with cost. But we, 2 years ago, had a 5-night-a-week patrol that covered not just the resort properties, but went out to, for those of you familiar with the access road area, went out to the farms, and it came back into Lincoln Peak and went as far up as the Summit condominiums up Village Drive, and it circled back down the access road and out German Flats to Mount Ellen, and then came back, and it patrolled that area on a more or less continuous loop. And we had agreements with the condominium associations, approximately 8 of them actually, at the peak, about what they would do. They wouldn't be expected to go into every condominium and make sure the door was locked, but they would respond to problems. They would respond to calls in the middle of the night with people having problems. But they would not be primarily law enforcement. That was not their intent. These were not licensed and certified law enforcement officials. But again, many of them had the background. They would merely be on watch.
Adam, where did people call? Was there a dispatch service or was it?
We did have a dispatch service that they had radio. Each of the patrol cars had a radio in it, and the resort operated a dispatch after we closed through. The resort dispatch was used until we closed, and then we used either the Sugarbush Inn or Claybrook front desk.
So if I were a condominium owner and saw suspicious activity, I would call a
That's
number
correct.
that was posted?
There was a number that was posted in the
Okay.
condominiums. And we went through the homeowners associations, and they had these numbers posted in each of the apartments or condominiums. That, I think, worked reasonably well. It was not cheap, and it wasn't a law enforcement operation. But again, just the presence of these people, and they were almost unequivocally, they were professional, they were not intrusive. They drove around in a car that clearly looked like a security car. We found that worked quite well. What was very, very difficult was getting all the associations to agree to help, to get involved and to help pay for the service. That is very difficult, as many of you might imagine. But again, I would say that that is kind of the ultimate example of regionalization, more or less a private police force. And I think from the towns and from the state standpoint, that is kind of what I would call a representation of a regional approach. As I think Mark mentioned, there are many towns in Vermont that have something along those lines. From, I don't know if you mentioned the Cadillac plan being Stowe, but I would assume that would be an example of a Cadillac plan, where I think they have 14 police officers, and I think the line item in the budget is over $1 million. There are other examples. My colleague from Woodstock I spoke to today, they have 3 patrollers. And I'm sure there are many other iterations in between. But I think the general message that I would communicate is that these resources are available, but they are available at a cost. So it's really, I think, up to the towns to decide how much they need and how much they can afford.
Thank you, Adam. Go ahead, Jerry. Absolutely.
Just a follow-up to you, Adam. Can you tell us approximately how much that 15-hour-a-day service cost the association members in Sugarbush?
Right. We had as a budget item, and it was 1 patroller and 1 car. We provided the dispatch service, and I believe our budget item was $20 an hour. So, yeah, I don't have the exact number, but it was $20 or $21 an hour.
And that was seasonal?
Interestingly enough, it was not seasonal. It was intended to be year-round. And we operated it year-round for a year. But the way we worked it with the condominium associations is we basically looked at the size of the number of units in the association and the remoteness of the association. For example, the farms being a more remote facility, being dispersed, that was a larger budget item than Snow Creek that had more units to it, but they were 114 units, I think, altogether. So it was an easier route. So we looked at number of units, we looked at how where they were located, and then we just divvied up the cost.
I'd just like to make an observation and begin by thanking Sam Hill, who's been in a lot of these forums over the last 5 years that I can think of. And, you know, we come to this juncture quite often, or we have come to this juncture quite often in the last 3 or 4 years, where, you know, we have a vehicle essentially enforcing vehicle safety and DUI issues, and we have no way of getting beyond that. In other words, you know, what transpired here the other day when we had a citizen, you know, basically chasing a person who'd broken into multiple homes, you know, using his own wits, and thank God it ended without injury, is an indication here that we're facing some different challenges regarding property break-ins and vehicle thefts, and you know, the costs are just staggering. I can't tell you how many times when John Southwick was sheriff here, every year when he'd come in to the select board, and finally we bought him a cruiser, and then we'd say, John, what would it take to ramp this law enforcement up to a point where we could actually apprehend, investigate, you know, and so forth? And he said, he would always point to Stowe and said, well, just look over, you know, if you, at that time it was like 500,000. And we said, well, we'll go from a budget of 25,000 to 500,000, no way.
Charlie, you just finished working on the budget for this year. What does it $25,000 raises a penny on the tax rate? Is that correct?
No, I think it's up to 32,000 or something like that.
32,000 will raise the tax rate 1 cent.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody have a calculator and want to tell me what $1.6 million would do to Waitsfield's tax rate?
Darryl, you can do
iPhone
that.
people? I'm just, I mean, I
But-
think it's something that Charlie raises a
but-
valid point.
You know, the other issue has always come up, and my good friend Jared is here, that law enforcement has pretty much been thought about in this valley as having geographical boundaries. You know, the cross-patrolling with Warren is actually a breakthrough in that regard, but we have, you know, for how many years, you know, tried to get you know, Faiston on board just to participate in the cross-patrolling program, because it's pretty illogical for Peter to, you know, not go up the German Flats Road, or not go on Route 17 or number 9 Hill or whatever. So I think we're at a juncture now where we have to stop thinking about law enforcement having geographical boundaries here and look at it as at least a 4-town issue. And you know, we have a recreational district where our towns contribute every year a certain amount, and we deal with recreation as at least a 3-town operation. But Moortown's a critical piece in this, and somehow, you know, Faiston would go from a 0 contribution to law enforcement to $100,000. And if Bob Vassar were here, you know, he'd fall over backwards. But if we were to institute what Sam has been talking about, not with 6 officers, say 3 officers, you know, we'd be looking at a contribution probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000 per town. So, you know, and right now, we basically sometimes come out at a net even on or we take in as much in fines as we put out in expenses to run our police department. And that's one of the reasons that the select board sometimes would say, well, geez, you know, let's just keep it going, you know, I mean, but you're not going to be collecting, doing patrolling and you know, felony type arrests, and the only time that Peter can intervene in those sorts of things is when he makes an arrest and finds drugs in the car, and then it's like, whew, you know, I made a sort of criminal intervention here through a vehicle intervention. So, I don't know, we're at the same place that we've come to, I'd say several times before, and I don't know what the answer is, but these gentlemen over here have laid out some numbers here that seem pretty real to me, and we need to think about that.
Thank you, Charlie. I'd like to open it up to questions from the public now, and if you would please identify yourself. John?
Hi, my name is John Jameson. I'm in the insurance business.
Can you all hear John?
Can't hear him.
Why don't you come down front, John, and turn around and talk backwards at the crowd?
I'm in the insurance business, and thus property crimes are a bigger deal to me than domestic violence or motor vehicle incidents. There's 6 people in this room right here that have had conversations with me about problems that they've had from a property crime situation. And to a T, all 6 of them have had these property crimes occur between 2 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the morning. And in my opinion, that if you're going to spend money, you're going to have to spend a lot of money to make a difference in property crime, because you're going to have to cover that time period. And in my opinion, to spend money without covering that time period is a waste of time. And you're going to have to get creative about what else you're going to do. I think something has to be done, but I think spending money that doesn't cover that window is a real problem, particularly with the economy the way it is and people trying to cut back in every place they can. So I have a concern about that.
Thank you, John.
Again, not domestic violence or motor vehicle, which are issues.
Thank you. Raymond?
I'd like to go back a little bit with the constables. We have started a little association called the Mad River Community Police Association. And that's what the constables in the valley we're trying to get organized a little bit to help the local residents. We're on call about 24 hours a day for no pay. And so we're trying to get a system going. But we have found our biggest problem is if there's a break-in or something is stolen or a speeder, we don't get notified unless we hear it through the grapevine or at the coffee shop. And we don't get any communication from the state police or the sheriff's department. It's like this week here, on that car chase with all the stolen cars, one more car was found in Sugarbush. If the state police or the sheriff's department would send us constables an email, with these different numbers, because we're here all the time. But for some reason, they don't want to communicate with us. And we aren't out to write tickets. Our main goal was to be to help them, to be their eyes and ears, to work with them. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, if I'm out and they don't want us to have any communication with them on the radio, we're jeopardizing ourselves. And it's like there's 3 departments, the constables, the state police, and the sheriffs. Sure, the sheriffs don't want us out there writing tickets because that's going to take money away from them. And
Are town constables authorized to write tickets?
sure are. Yes, we
Speeding
are.
tickets.
We can write, we have the same powers as the state police and the sheriff's department. In fact, in our town, we have more authority than the state police and the deputies. The only people that have more authority than the constables is the fire chief and the Washington County sheriff.
Let me just stop you for a minute, because I want to ask 2 questions, which you're bringing up. One is it an issue of cost or liability, or why wouldn't any of you law enforcement people communicate with a deputy who you knew was on patrol? My second question is for you select board members. How do you authorize your constables, and do you govern them, and do you police them, and do you train? So hold that. I want to hear about who is or isn't communicating with constables.
Well, I'll step right up. To start with, I hate to jump on any one person, but the conversation that I had with Bill was more general than that, about calling, and he wanted to be able to call if he saw something, again, just general radio use. My problem with that, and on the face, it does not sound good here. But when I'm looking, as we've all been talking about cost, and I have constables from Cabot wanting to use our radio, Marshfield, Plainfield, Worcester, again, it comes back to the more people that are using our system, and the more people that end up using Berry City, the more cost that we have.
Are you talking about a dispatching cost or the actual
A
use of the radio?
a
The radio.
dispatching cost.
Okay.
So when we talked about, because one thing does lead to another, and it uses the radio airtime. So when we talked, I said, you have the ability to use the state police frequency. They've given you their permission. We have that. We monitor that. So we have communication. Almost every law enforcement vehicle in the state has channel 2, which is a kind of a car-to-car. So between those two channels alone, we had communication. And when I had that discussion with him, I thought we would be in full communication with Bill or any other constable that has that ability through the state. And we would, of course, if there was a dire emergency and something was happening, it got on our channel and said, could you come and help? I'm not going to be all upset about it, but as a general usage, how many channels do you need?
So how does it work at the state police day? There is a channel dedicated, or constables can share your channels, or?
Well, no. The Warren constable, Bill Beatman, came to me and specifically asked for permission. And what it really came down to was assigning him a call number, a radio number, something that he could be identified by over the radio, because you don't want just anybody obviously picking up a microphone and talking over the radio. I actually probably went out on a limb a little bit because Bill had been very helpful for us, and it's valuable to us to have the extra eyes and ears out there. And I went through the steps to get him assigned a call number to use the radio purely as what we call a lifeline. If he needs help, he can call for help. But it was with the understanding that he couldn't check registrations, he couldn't check licenses because he hasn't been through the NCIC training that Sam talked about earlier. What I extended to Bill was simply a lifeline service. So if he's out there on his own at 2 a.m. and needs some help, he can pick up the radio and call.
Is that lifeline service available to other constables in the Middlesex coverage area?
I've not been asked for it by any of the others. It would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Now, to follow up on Ray's comments, about why can't we notify the constables? It sounds like a logical thing. If I'm the constable in Fayston and you're investigating a crime in Fayston, why can't you call and tell me as the Fayston Town Constable? But it sounds simple enough, but does that mean that, my troopers, if they're investigating a burglary in Plainfield, they got to remember to call the Plainfield Constable. And if they're investigating something in Williamstown, they got to remember to call the Williamstown Constable. And if they're investigating something in Duxbury, well, the Duxbury Constable doesn't want to know, so don't bother calling him. It's too much to try to keep track of which constables want to be involved, which ones don't, and it's just, the caseloads they're carrying on a day-to-day basis are such that they don't always have the time to remember to think, oh, wait a minute, this is in Fayston, Ray's the Fayston Constable, and he wants to know.
Thanks. How about, what do you guys say? Go ahead, tell me what's going on in your towns in terms of your constables.
I have a follow-up question
Okay.
for the commander of the Middlesex Barracks. Looking to this year's budget process, are you looking at further cuts in your budget? And if so, how will that impact the coverage in Washington County or in the 20 towns that you have jurisdiction over, your barracks?
Talking about the state budget as a whole, we've been very fortunate in that we have not been cut at all in terms of sworn law enforcement officers. We have had administrative staff cut. We've lost clerical support, but we had not, and I don't anticipate that we will lose any troopers. Our vacancies are just purely due to attrition and the fact that it takes so long. Like right now, I'm carrying 2 vacancies. I fully expect I will get at least one, if not both of them, filled when the current academy class graduates. But the process to identify candidates, put them through the hiring process, put them through the training process, by the time, from application to being a self-sufficient trooper is easily a year. So it's not a matter of carrying vacancies because of budget cuts, it's a matter of carrying vacancies because it takes so long to fill those positions once we have a vacancy.
And a follow-up, but not related to budget, and this is a question for all our law enforcement professionals here. Are property crimes on the rise in Vermont? Have you noticed a trend in the last 18 months, 24 months in either the town of Stowe or county of Washington County or statewide?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. What you've experienced down here over the last 3 months is kind of an anomaly. It's, you know, we can attribute probably 20 stolen cars and 100 thefts from cars to one individual or group of individuals, and that's an odd spike that you're going to have this year. All in all, I mean, if you watch the news at all, you've seen there's been a tremendous amount of armed robberies over the last 2 years, which was virtually unheard of in Vermont 2 years ago, up until 2 years ago. Property crimes in general, I think we probably all would agree that they're on the rise, sure.
What are you seeing in Stowe, Ken?
I would think you'd see property rising, you know, in pretty much in every community. Stowe's no different in that regard. What we do is, again, you know, the luxury of having people out there 24 hours a day, you know, it's a physical deterrent. We use the mountain. The mountain hires us. We work up there between the peak hours of 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., and that's called a passive patrol. That passive patrol is an officer who just basically concentrates on the ski area, goes in and out of the retail shops, and just is a high visibility presence. I started that about 7 years ago. 7 years prior, 8 years ago, I was averaging 12 to 20 pairs of skis stolen a week. Last year, I had 27 pairs stolen for the year. And that's because of the people up there. Now, that one officer is there. At the same time, at 2 o'clock, we have 2 other officers come up for the different cash rooms, one at Spruce and one at Mansfield. And then I have the other 2 officers that are up. They go up, you know, to the mountain because they're up there for accidents. They're up there for, you know, frauds and things of that nature. So there's a high visibility. When you have that, you know, that cuts back. Again, you know, Stowe's, you know, different. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the communities, but we don't have a lot of break-ins because probably 80% of the homes in Stowe, the businesses, have alarms. You're not going to break into a house that has, or a business has an alarm when you can go to the neighboring town that doesn't have an alarm. The insurance gentleman, he made a comment, and I just wrote this down. Depending on the amount and level of service that you have and the proactivity that you have amongst the officers that you have working, that 2 to 5, you know, 2 to 5 or 2 to 7, I'm looking at 3 to 5 because some of my officers, I have round-the-clock protection. But between the hours of 3 and 5, and I was thinking of having my night shift cut back and being on call. And so I pulled out the statistics. So in last year, I had over 47, almost 4,800 complaints. 159 were between the hours of 3 and 5. Now, can you live with that as a, if you compare the stats? But if you're one of those people calling in those 159 complaints, you want some service. But, you know, that's a small number by comparison to the other number of complaints. So if you have enough people, you know, if you have that visibility and that presence, you are going to cut. But Stowe's no different than anyone else. We have property crimes. I could have, you know, 10 officers out there on Halloween night, and I'll still have vandals, you know, doing something. There's going to be a property crime out there.
Could you identify yourself?
My name's Susan Lee. I just had a question, a point of clarification in those figures that were cited earlier, approximately $700,000 to $750,000. That's manpower expenses. Am I correct in assuming that that's manpower and that does not account for the facility and the equipment and the cars and the garage and all the, I understand that the dispatch is a separate line item in their budget, but that's strictly manpower?
For the sheriff's department, that's manpower, training, equipment. They actually have a capital budget line item in their budget. So that pays for all the people, all equipment, all the usage. The sheriff's department, because it's operated out of the sheriff's department, is a function of the county. So that building is used, so there's no cost for the actual facility. Barry Town, because it's in the municipal building, their police department, I don't think that they budget for the facility itself, but their budget includes the same things, all the operating costs.
So Sam, did you say it did include cruisers and the vehicles?
Maintenance for and ability to purchase new through capital improvements. They have to, yeah, unfortunately, it's a cost. They have to come from somewhere. And they're-
I can't see who you are, but I.
Don LaHaye, Warren. Does the liability land back on the sheriff's department when you're doing patrol for a town that's under contract?
Yes, we carry liability insurance, but there's always vicarious liability. I mean, the town could have some liability just for the sake that they contract with us, but we carry that professional liability if we do something.
Is going to be, maybe we could hitch up some situation with Sugarbush with a security system that will come around, because I worked for Hunter North, and I had a situation where I got called in with prescription drugs, and I called the state police within, travel time from Middlesex to Sugarbush was within 15 minutes, they responded. So, you know, as far as these security systems goes, and in relationship with the state police is great. And I think this is something that maybe some of these towns could incorporate, because I think if you look at the records that come in, how many arrests are being made for break-ins and property damage that we're getting now on these late-night patrols that they're supposed to be doing. I think this could be done with a security system
Let's ask,
incorporated.
that's a good, they raise a good point. Let's ask Ken and also Adam. What do other ski resorts in Vermont do? What do other resort communities do in terms of having a police force, not having a police force,
Well,
contracting out?
I'm going to be honest with you. I've been in Vermont now since 1971. And years ago, before I went to Stowe, I never understood why this area didn't have a police force, and Stowe did. And it does. Everything comes down, what we're hearing is cost. There's no question about it, it's cost. And it's all, everything's money. But I tell you, it all depends on the level of service that you want. Training, professionalism, that comes, with, the training and everything that will develop. But if you have a three-man police force, and you want to know how many property crimes are solved, if you don't have anybody here, hardly any are going to get solved. The more police you have, you're going to have that many more complaints. And I use my example of just my animal control officer. 3 years ago, I didn't have 24 complaints. And now, our animal control officer does everything from birds in a house, to snakes in a house, to roadkill, and everything that nobody wants to do. And she had over 700 complaints. So the more police you have, you're going to get more complaints, because they're going to be more proactive, they're going to be doing more things, they're going to be responding to things, they're going to be taking complaints. When you call, they're there, they're going to respond, they're going to take action. They don't have to come from Middlesex, which is stretched. They're going to have not come from the sheriff's department, which is stretched thin. You're going to have your own municipal police department, which is there for you, the residents, to they're going to aid and you everything that you need. But you're going to overwhelm them, I think. You're going to find that we want to report now. We want to report the ski thefts. The shops that aren't reporting that they got broken into or they had some shoplifting. I mean, we sit there and have shoplifting reports, bad checks. We handle every bad check, that comes through, the community. Those are things that probably aren't getting reported now. All those things, if you get a police force, those are all things that you're going to want to have handled. Because those are property theft. That's things that are affecting you and your businesses. And you're going to want those resolved. And just on checks alone, we probably have well over a 95% collection, basically I call it collection rate. But that's what you'll find. If you have 3 people within a couple years, you're going to say, we need 5 people, because we've gone from handling 1,000 complaints to 2,500 complaints.
And what happens in Stratton or Killington? Does anybody have the answer?
I don't have the answer. I do know that Smuggler's Notch, I believe, has a private security force. Ludlow has a town police department, and they also cover the mountain. I don't know about Stratton or Mount Snow or the like. So I guess the general message is each resort kind of does its own thing.
Thank you, Adam.
And what are you doing now? You said you were using Hunter North, are you still using them?
We are. We don't have the frequency of patrol, but we still are, yeah.
You're happy with that?
We're happy with it. They do a good job. We've always had a good experience with them, but it's a question of, we would personally prefer more patrol. There's, like I said, we can have anything we want if we're willing to pay for it, and that's something that we are always thinking about.
Thank you. Clayton?
I've got two questions. One is, with such massively different budgets for Stowe and the police department in the Matter of Valley.
Wait, no, I think you might want to, can you guys hear him?
Sorry.
Speak in both directions.
The Stowe Police Department has a, was it $1.6 million, Ken?
Yes.
Budget this year, and a number of officers, 14 full-time, and then a number of part-time officers.
Right.
And the Matter of Valley has no police department. I'm very curious to hear, how do the crime rates relate the Stowe rate versus the Matter of Valley rate? And how do the successful prosecutions and crime resolution rates compare between the two areas? That's one question. And the next question is, which is completely separate, the incident that I think Ray was alluding to last week, where we had an 18-year-old Warren resident who was chased down by another young Warren resident and then successfully apprehended by, I think, by the Vermont State Police in Barrie. A lot of people were so happy to see that cooperation between the law enforcement and the local citizenry, but they were very frustrated to hear that he was out on bail for $1,000 within, days of having been arraigned. And I'm just curious to know, where does it all lead to in terms of all that effort and money? Is there some real protection, or are they generally getting back out on the street and getting back to their mischief?
Well, you're asking what you should have as the Commissioner of Corrections here, and if he was honest, what he's going to tell you is that all the jails are full.
Right.
And if we arrest somebody that breaks into your store, and let's say he's not a repeat offender, but he's been convicted of other property crimes, what's going to probably happen is he's going to get a suspended sentence, because if you put him in jail, you have to release somebody on the other end. And who do you want to release on the other end? Is it somebody worse that's going to come into your community? It will be a sexual predator? It's somebody who's got 12 convictions for burglary? I mean, we get frustrated ourselves as well. We arrest somebody, we use domestic violence, because that's big in the forefront now. The first time, it gets amended to a simple assault. The next time they get a suspended sentence. We might have to arrest that same person 3 times before they actually get a domestic violence conviction, where now there's all sorts of things that affect. We take their guns away. They lose a lot of rights, incorporated therein. So it's frustrating for us as well. We see things where it used to be, if 1/4 of the state is under suspension. That's a known statistic. But legislature a few years ago changed it so that they decriminalized it somewhat. So now we have to catch somebody 6 times before that. If I catch you for speeding and you don't have a license, so I write you a couple tickets. You don't pay those tickets, you go under suspension. I see you driving a week later, I write you another ticket for this time you don't have insurance, and I write you a couple more. You're under suspension. But I wrote you 1 ticket, so now you've got 2. I've got to catch you 4 more times doing the same things before that becomes a criminal offense. And now I finally catch you on that 7th offense for driving under suspension criminally, and you think, all right, we're going to get that scofflaw off the streets. And you go up and pay a $200 fine, and you probably drive back home. So it's frustrating for us as well. And I got up, and I am being facetious, but a couple years ago, someone asked, how can I afford more protection? And I got up and I was being flip, and I said, I can almost guarantee you that I can prevent every one of you from being involved in a property crime. There's 5,000 residents, you give me 5,000 cops, I'll have one with you all the time. You know, it's not reasonable, and that's being flipped to say that. You know, I don't care how many police you have out there, there's going to be crime. You know, it frustrates us to no end sometimes when the day shift comes in and my night shift has been out there and they've been proactive and they may have gotten some drunk, they may have arrested somebody for an assault, because that's, you know, when those type of, you know, things occur. And then all of a sudden, I get 6 burglaries come in, you know, that happen. I'm going, what was my night shift doing? And so it doesn't matter. You're still going to have that type of activity.
What, I think Clayton Paul's other question was about conviction rates.
Well,
Crime rates.
Or
Crime
crime
rates?
rates, sorry, yeah.
And both.
Well, I don't know what our conviction rate is. I mean, we certainly we rank high in the state in the number of arrests. We rank fairly high in the state in the number of Part 1 crimes, which are your more serious, you know, crimes. I think it was a couple of years ago, we ranked like 7th or 9th in the state in that category.
Part 1, did you say, Ken?
Right, Part 1 crimes.
What is a Part 1 crime?
Those are your major crimes. Those are your burglaries, your larcenies, your homicides, your car thefts, your aggravated assaults, and then you go down to the next parts, which are shoplifting, vandalisms, you know, things of that nature. We try, like I say, when a citizen calls us, you know, we take everything is considered serious to us. A shoplifting, a bad check. You know, if we get stacked with 10 calls, we have to prioritize, but we're going to get your complaint and we're going to make you satisfied. If not, I'm going to hear about it. You're going to call me and say, you weren't happy with my officer's performance. So we're going to do that. And we're going to go to the utmost extent that we can to solve that crime. Do we solve them all? No, we don't solve them all, and I don't know statistically what we do. But I'd say we do a very good share. Again, we don't have as many burglaries as a lot of other communities, and I don't know how many you have here. But again, that's because our businesses are alarmed. And I encourage people to have alarms, because alarm is a deterrent. I actually like the silent alarms, because that way we've caught people inside who just want to wait for our arrival.
Thank you, Ken. I can see your hand raised on. Go ahead.
Are Part 1 crimes felonies?
For the most part, they are, yes.
Okay, and the difference between the felony and the misdemeanor?
By definition, it's the amount of jail time that you would serve.
2.5 years?
I think it's 2 years.
2 years in a
Anything
state-
over 2 years is a felony. Anything under is a misdemeanor.
And that's 2 years in a state penitentiary?
Right.
But that's not to say you're actually going to serve 2 years.
Right.
Any
Right.
crime that has the
But
potential of 2 years or more.
Yeah,
Excuse me,
right.
more than 2 years. It's a felony.
Yes, Clayton
And
Paul.
just following up on that last question, Lieutenant White and Sheriff Hill, from your two perspectives, do you see a higher crime rate in Stowe compared to the Mad River Valley? How do they, I mean, so much money is being spent over there compared to here. Is there a real difference in terms of,
Well, I'm afraid I didn't have enough time to really dig down into the weeds as far as crime rates. You know, I ran some basic numbers of our activities down here, but not really knowing what crime rate is in Stowe, and I don't have the numbers here with me for the Valley
but
Town.
just your instinct, managing the Vermont State Police for Washington County? There's some people that work in.
Well, the chief hit it right on the head. Having the police force there is going to cause you to have more crimes reported. I have no doubt that a lot of, relatively minor property crime takes place down here that we never know about simply because people they think, what's the point in picking up the phone and calling? The stolen skis, the bad checks, the minor shoplifting. I have no doubt that a lot of that takes place that we never know about because people just don't take the time to report it. Whereas when they know there's a police department in town that can be there in 5 minutes, they're more likely to report it.
I ran just some basic numbers, and I ran a little bit different of a year than Ken did. But for the year 2009, total incidents that the state police received was, between Waitsfield and Warren, was 761, where Stowe had 4,500. So,
However,
but when you look at that and break it down, I mean, that's total incidents, but that includes foot patrols, different escorts, that's everything that they did. So when you have a full-time police department, you have that extra service and you do extra things. So you'd really have to look at incident for incident to see what the comparison is. But overall, because they're there 24/7, they're just by nature going to have a lot more complaints.
So it's very difficult to separate the potentially false impression that a budget feeds itself from there's a real difference. Because Police Chief Kaplan was saying, if you've got the officers, you'll have the incident reports. It goes up commensurately. But it must be very difficult to compare that to actual crime resolution and rates that exist in the shadows in the Matter Valley that you're not hearing about here, that you would hear about in Stowe.
Well, one thing I mentioned, I was talking here myself with the constables, the hard part, communication is key in any aspect of life. And to have Channel 2 so that you can actually call someone on the state, that's great. Why aren't you being contacted? Because he said, I don't know which ones to contact, and there's 16 of you, but, I wasn't, on this committee to as a proponent or antagonist, whatever. With the ample training, the training that you get, 180 hours worth of training, you come back, if you can get on to the CAD system, which is through the dispatch, or in your own office, however the connection is made, you get that NCIC training, the VCIC training, you get the CAD training, you can have basically a desktop computer that's going to allow you access to see. You punch in a geographic center of what, like Stowe is 0808, and I punch it in, or I punch in the county. I want to see what happened in Marshall when I come in the morning. I punch in their code, and I see all the activities that happened. If you wanted to know what happened in Waitsfield that night, you punch it in, and it's going to come up and show you everything that was reported, that night. We ourselves, we talk about interagency, the cooperation or regionalization. We don't have any constables that. Well, we have a constable that's a good friend of mine, but he doesn't go out and doesn't do anything proactive just because of the magnitude of the police force itself. But I've got a list of by individual. You can sit there and, like we said, when we have 4,800 crimes, 4,800 incidents, that's not 4,800 crimes. And I've got them all broken down if anybody wants to see what they are. That ranges everything from your armed robbery to a cat up a tree. And of course, that's that's prioritized as to when you have a full-time police department, what do you want us to do? There was a time and place when I was chief of Stowe and Waterbury, and I implemented for Waterbury foot patrol. I wanted you get out there and go out and see the merchants. Spend a half an hour just walking up down to the stores and saying hi to everybody. If you do that, you'll be amazed how many people go. Because what I see myself sometimes, I go into some restaurants and I see they have we'll call it the Hall of Shame of bad checks. And I'm going, why don't you call us about that? Oh, I didn't know you handled that. And next thing I know, I get 20 of them from them.
I'm going to take a couple more questions. Ginny, and then we've got to wrap it up, and then I'll come back to you. Go ahead, Ginny.
My question is, if the Sheriff's Department was hired for patrolling, what would be their obligations? What would they be required to do?
Do you mean in terms of types of patrol?
Yeah.
We are. We're contracted now with both Waitsfield and Warren for patrol. As I said earlier, Waitsfield contracts for about 16 hours a week, and Warren contracts for 24 hours a week. 32 of those hours we do combined patrols between the two communities, and then Warren pays for additional 8 hours that they get separately. To keep the cost minimal based on our staffing and to assist the communities, we charge a minimal fee, and we are out here, as we are in the other towns we contract with, for motor vehicle patrol for highway safety. We do have the agreement with the state police that we will respond to any major incident in any community that we're working in or near if they request our assistance. So when we come to work in Waitsfield or Warren, we actually sign on with the state police to let them know that we're out here. And that's not to say that if we don't come on to something, we don't address it. And a lot of things that we do is pass information on to the state police or whichever agency, whether it's state or federal or local, that the information should go
Well,
to.
that's really not my question. Perhaps I said it wrong. If you were hired not to do motor vehicle patrolling, if you were hired to patrol the streets for safety of businesses or any kind of domestic violence or anything, is that something, I mean, do we specify what you can do, or do you tell us what you do?
Well, that's back to the cost issue, that we get into the disjoint patrol that I discussed if we're not covering a large enough time frame that we and the state police may be sharing the complaints, and that's just really difficult to do. But our costs revolve around dispatch cost, officer certification, depending on how long or how large that contract is, because if officers start working over 32 hours a week, then they need to be full-time certified. So we're looking at different levels of law enforcement. So yes, absolutely. The question, or the answer to your question is yes, depending on the agreement, depending on the funding, we could provide certain services. But at this point, because to keep our costs low and your costs low, we're providing the extra patrol, and the agreement we have with the state police assists with that. So that's why we do the motor vehicle patrol that we do now.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question. I don't know your name. I'd like to ask you to state your name.
Hi, Carla Straight-Messer, Waitsfield. I was involved a number of years, well, a couple of years ago, I guess, in some training about neighborhood watch in this area from the LEPC 5. And I wonder if maybe Paul could address what's been happening with neighborhood watch. Has that been helpful to you? Because what occurs to me that in this budget climate, we all need to take responsibility for how we can protect ourselves and how we can help you to help us. So I guess that's basically my question.
Well, you actually probably know more about it than I do, Carla, but in terms of the neighborhood watch, the initial startup consists of training, townspeople to serve on neighborhood teams, for lack of a better word, just to be eyes and ears for us and for their neighbors and for themselves, just to stay connected, keep each other advised of different happenings in the neighborhood. We currently have a system in place where we send out, whenever we make an arrest or whenever we're sending out a press release to the media, we also send it to the neighborhood watch group so that they're aware of the crimes that are taking place within their community. To be quite honest, the reverse flow of information has been pretty much non-existent. I don't get a whole lot back.
Thank you. And one more question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Charlie Burbank, and questions about numbers, sort of. Lieutenant White said he had 14 troopers, and he's down to 11 right now. And for the Sheriff's Department, I believe the last information I received from your department, you have 10 full-time officers and 36 part-time?
We've just had some changes. I think this morning when I was looking, we have 44 total, yes.
Okay, so full-time officers, you have about the same, and you're covering basically the same territory. And
Well, let me explain what my officers do, because that's not a true statement that we're covering the same territory. 5 of my officers are working on a contract through the court administrator's office for court security, so that's their full-time function. 2 of my full-time officers, their main function, they're paid for by the state to provide transportation of prisoners. 2 of my full-time officers, their main function is serving civil process. And then I have 1 other full-time that is a floater that does a little bit of everything. So I don't have 10 full-time people that are out taking complaints.
Okay, so I can get to my question here is, from the information you gave me this last summer, I was a little concerned, as the community is here, about what I call the difference between motor vehicle arrests and criminal things. And the information you gave me was that your whole department only made 9 felony arrests last year. And you explained a little bit of it before when you said these officers are designated here and designated there. But I do believe that you're paid by the state to be a sheriff.
That's
and
correct.
And I do think that maybe instead of sitting in your office working up private contracts, maybe you should be out here in the valley or something, or out with what your salary's paying you for. Maybe you can explain why this isn't so.
Well, my function as the sheriff is to, but the main function of the sheriff is to make sure that the prisoners are moved and that the civil process is taken care of and served efficiently. Beyond that, the main function is as the administrator of the office. As anyone that runs a small business, I have those responsibilities. Taking care of insurances, taking care of the day-to-day complaints, the scheduling. I do get out and serve some civil process. I do transport prisoners, but being that it's a contract function for patrol, we use those contract funds to pay the deputies to go out and do that patrol. So it doesn't take away from the taxpayers that are paying my salary for the function that I'm supposed to be providing.
Thank you.
seem to think that-
We have to wrap up. The big picture has other events scheduled for this space in 4 minutes. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, the law enforcement officials and the elected officials for coming, and thank you all for coming. I encourage you all to, there's a lounge out there if you want to talk amongst yourselves or Shanghai these guys for more questions. Thank you all.